All right. We start out this evening in chapter 11, which is one of the last two chapters in this book, where he deals with the words of wisdom in view of the aging process. That's going to be toward the end that you start talking about those who are young and how they ought to live their life in their youth. And the first part of that, somewhat regarding diligence and our benevolent nature and so forth, and then come down to the conclusion. Lord willing, if we go according to schedule, which rarely happens, we'll be finishing the book of Ecclesiastes next Wednesday evening, and then starting the book of Proverbs. We'll stay in Proverbs then through until the end of the year, and that's when we'll be starting some new classes at that point in time. All right, let's get started with chapter 11 then. First two verses. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. That statement is one that I think is familiar when you look at it, the first one. Cast your bread upon the water. What's meant by that? How do you hear that phrase used many times, if you have, in our world today? Cast your bread on the water. What? Okay. Anybody else there? Typically, the idea that is given is one that's a hope of return. But I think the point is that there is this cast your bread upon the water, that you do what is right and good. Basically, I would tend to think that it has to do with a benevolent nature, given the next thing that is said, give a serving to 7 and also to 8. For you do not know what evil will be on the earth. That there's a readiness to give. Really much the same thing as you have in the book of Ephesians. That you do not steal if you've stolen before, but you work with your hands for what's good that you may have to give to the one who is in need. When you talk about casting your bread upon the water, for you'll find it after many days, you give it away, and then what happens? It comes back to you. Now, is that the reason you give it away, is so you can get it back at some? No. But the point is that tends to happen. When we talk about people who are caring for others, many times they're the ones who are cared for best when they are in a time of need themselves. If they've been the ones who've done that, others have seen that, they're more willing or they're more ready to help that kind of a person. And that's the point that's made here. Overall, I think all of us recognize that. When we see someone that's of that nature, a good, caring person, and they get into a time of hardship or a time of difficulty, we're ready to help them. And that's the point that's being made, it seems to me, in this passage. Anybody else got a comment there? Okay. When he talks about giving a serving to 7 and also to 8, you see this a lot of times in Hebrew literature, that they talk about a number. There are 6 things Jehovah hates. Yea, 7 are an abomination to him. Why is that done that way? First the number and then move it up 1. What is that a tool using? Do what? Okay. All right. When you're moving it up 1, what's the point of that? Okay, even more, beyond, always abounding. In the Greek language, that's the kind of a statement that is made about that. Abounding, doing this and abound. 2 Peter chapter 1 talks about that these things are yet more. Those kind of points would say you need to do this and do it in abundance, or keep on doing it. And that's the point. You give that serving to 7, indeed even to 8. You're ready to help as much as you possibly can. Why? Because you do not know what evil will be on the earth. The idea is we need to be ready to be abundant in our giving, benevolent in that, because we never know when it may be needed, when it may be some time that calls for a special degree of help and need to have a readiness to do that at any time. All of us recognize that point, whether we've put it in those words or not. I remember a few years ago going over into the Philippines, and while I was over there, there was the typhoon that came through that had the strongest winds ever recorded on the earth and devastated places, and a number of people from here and other places were ready to help, and the people in the Philippines were amazed at how much that was something that people were ready to help them so quickly, and that because they had already set that aside. They had a readiness to give, and I've always appreciated that fact that this congregation was especially liberal in the benevolent action that was taking place there. All right, anything else on either of those two verses? So be ready to be one who gives, to help, to be caring for those who are in need. Now, how do you get to that place of readiness? What makes you provide for that? In verse 3, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God, who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and in the evening do not withhold your hand. For you do not know which will prosper, either this or that, or whether both alike will be good. That point on the cloud, that when the cloud comes, it gives forth its rain. At what point? When the cloud's what? Full, it says. The idea is you may have clouds up there a great deal of time, but they may not be giving anything forth at a given point in time. But when that is time for that to happen, the point is made by Solomon, that's when they'll empty themselves upon the earth. In other words, these things are sure to take place. They're sure to happen. That rain is going to come. So, recognize, you may not know when it's going to, but that provision is going to be there. He goes on from that and says, if a tree falls to the north or south, that's where it's going to lie. Well, what does that have to do with anything? What's the point with regard to that? Okay, there you are. The idea that you're not in control of that, that is happening beyond you. Just like the rain and when it's going to come, same thing with a tree that's there. It's going to lie where it falls. It's not going to suddenly turn around just for your convenience or something. Now, what happens when we do that? All of this is going to be provided for. That's the point that's being made in verses 3 and 4. So now what application does he make? Where is he applying that to? Verse 5, verse 4, pardon me. He who observes the wind, what's he going to do? He's not going to sow. Why? Oh, it's too windy to sow. I got to wait till this wind calms down. And then the idea is, or how the bones grow in the womb of a. You don't know how the bones grow in the womb of her that's with child. Well, then what would that person do? If I don't know how that happens, I might just tend to say, well, I don't want to be involved in that. Then I don't know. I can't control all of that. What's the point? Go on and do what you need to do. These things have been taken care of by God. I think the point that's made in that, as you go down to the very... you do not know the works of God who makes everything. In other words, God is behind this. He's made a system, or he's made a world in which there is a balance. These things are going to take place, one after another. We don't control that, but he's made it to where these kinds of things happen in a world. Do I know when there's going to be a drought? No. If I try to come along and say, well, I know it's probably going to happen this year, then I don't plant. Well, chances are, I didn't know that. I mean, we don't even have good forecasting through a week, much less for a year. But you can't have that kind of thing. Well, I'm going to think maybe it won't happen, so I won't sow. How many times do you reap a crop that you don't sow? That's a sure one. If I don't sow it, then what? Not going to get anything out of it. Now, might one sow a crop and not get anything out of it because there's a drought? Yeah, sometimes that happens. And those things take place. But you act in a way, working diligently, so that what's dependent upon you is what's done. He says, now, he that looks at the wind won't sow. The ones that regard the clouds won't reap. He says, now, as you don't know this, the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of a mother with the child, you don't know the works of God as a whole, how he makes everything, or how everything works. Could you possibly take one part of, let's say, an ecosystem and give an explanation of how, in detail, everything there works? Well, you might. A lot of scientists have tried that, and then they go back a little bit later, and guess what? They missed some stuff. They didn't recognize that there was an awful lot of other things involved. More and more as the human body is looked at, the genome process. It was the idea in the original thing that you had each of these little splices had to do with one thing. And that gave all of the information. But now we know that they interconnect with other parts. And what this one does in the exact same kind of code that you would have in another, yet another part of that chromosome is one that's in some way done differently. That combination is going to make it different for each of those people. It's incredibly complex. And what they're beginning to notice is now what they thought they would know and map out within a few years is something that they're only beginning to scratch the surface of now. And that's the same way in other things, that you find out it's more complex than we thought it was. Well, who knew about all of that to start with? God did. And he made it in such a way that there would be a continuity. It would go on and have that ability. I don't know how to do that, but God does. So now what does that encourage me to do with regard to my diligence? What part can I take care of? All right, the doing with whatever it is my responsibility, right? And if I do that, I'm diligent in that, does that guarantee I'm going to have a good crop or whatever else? No, it doesn't guarantee anything. What it does is it gives everything that I can do, and I trust in a world that God made, overall, that's going to work out for good. That's the point that's being made. Don't think you have to be able to control everything before you do anything, or you'll do nothing. Because none of us have that kind of a control. Go ahead, Bo. Yeah. All right. Now, in that last phrase, he said, in the morning do what? Why in the morning? Does that mean you can only sow crops in the morning? What's the point of that? In the morning, sow your seed. In the evening, do not withhold your hand. Okay, that's true, but is that the point? What's at the back part of that? Think about the, in the evening, do not withhold your hand. Okay, that could be. Is this something that's talking about you continue in that working, or is this something that's tying the two parts of this that we've started with, verses 1 and 2, and now this, tying them together? I rather think the latter. In other words, in the morning you sow your seed. You begin by doing what is your responsibility, and what do you have then in the end? In the evening, do not withhold your hand. It may be saying continue that work. That may be very clearly what's there. Matter of fact, most of the time that I've taught this, I've taught exactly that. But the more I got to looking at it here a few years ago, the more I thought, wait a second, this seems to be a bridge with verse 1 and 2, that if I'm diligent in doing these things that I should, that's the way that in the end I'm going to have something ready to give to somebody else. I'm going to not withhold my hand, because there's going to be this product that is there overall. For you do not know which will prosper, he says. In other words, the reason you sow these seeds, you put that into effect, is because you don't know whether it's going to be corn or wheat or potatoes that are going to do good. So you plant in such a way that you're going to have something. I remember when I was a kid, there were farmers there in Panhandle of Texas that would have several different crops. And I remember asking one time, old fella, I said, why don't you just grow the same thing? It'd be simpler, wouldn't it? He said, yep. And every once in a while, you'd end up with nothing. And what he did was have crops that when one did well, another one probably wouldn't. And you had something like that where whatever happened, there was something to bring in of a crop in that sort of a way. That's the idea. I don't know what that's going to be, so I don't withhold my hand from any of that good of going out and sowing. He said, you don't know what will prosper, either this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Every once in a while you have that kind of a year where you can't miss. You know, everything does great. And those kind of things are real good. They keep a farmer from going into bankruptcy, I think. But those are the things that are there. So what do we do? In an agrarian society like Israel was at this time especially, they needed to remember that. There would be no way that they would have the things that they needed unless they worked and worked diligently. And when they did so, they had to recognize it doesn't all depend on you. It depends on God as well. You may not know why things happen, but overall, God would take care of them in the overall sense of it. All right, anything there? Anybody got a point? Go ahead. Go ahead and read. I think the word unworthy in yours is actually, the original word is unprofitable. And the reason you are unprofitable servants, when you look at this, it's obviously dealing with us and God, right? How in the world are we going to give God something that he didn't have to start with? And that's the point. If we do everything we should do, we're not benefiting God by doing something that he could not have done. But the point is, we're doing what our responsibility is. And that's the idea here. We need to be diligent and do our responsibility. All right, anybody else got anything? Okay, let's look at verse 7 and 8. Truly, the light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. But if a man lives many years and rejoices in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that is coming is vanity. When you think about that statement that is made, truly the light is sweet and it is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. What's the point there? I kind of like snow myself, but Lori back there and most of you like sunshine. And that kind of a thing that's pointed out there, that kind of brightness that makes people cheer up. I'll admit about spring I'm ready for it. But that kind of thing there, he's pointing out, is something that's good. It's something of what man desires. But he points out, but if a man lives many years, rejoices in them all, is all that there's going to be sweetness and light. What else is going to be a part of life? Darkness. And those days of darkness. What's meant by that, the days of darkness? Okay. All right. That's something that is almost a universal figure. Days of darkness. When you think about that, during a day, what do you expect? Light. But days of darkness, during this time you ought to expect light. What do you have? Darkness instead. That's a difficult time. Something that is worse than what we would expect to be. Now I want you to think about something with regard to how that's put together. He said it's great to have sweetness and light. It's pleasant. But if a man lives many years and does what? Rejoices in all of those years. How can you rejoice in all of those years and then it say, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many? I thought he rejoiced in all those years. But there was darkness all through there. Yeah, nice little COVID over there. Okay. Scott, you had something in there. Okay. Okay. Go ahead, Lee.
He started out with a lot, lost it all, and then he started out with, then he ended up with even more. And it's kind of like, of course, we know what happened behind the scenes, but for him, that's the way of life for a lot of people. And truly, if you go through bad times, I think it makes you appreciate the good times even more when it happens.
Okay. Have we seen anything else in the book of Ecclesiastes that talks about this balance between those two? There's a time to laugh and there's time to... Now, when you look at it from that standpoint, those two go together. We said they help us to get through this life in different ways, but they're both needed. And they're both to be seen as a part of life that bring about the total experience of what ought to be there. When you talk about the light is sweet, the sun, the day that is there, that brightness, that's good for a man. And he says he rejoices in those. Does that mean that the only time you can rejoice is in the time that's good? No. That's the difference between the word happiness and the word joy. And again, this word joy that's used in the Hebrew is much like what you have in the Greek in the New Testament. Joy has to do with something that is that inner peace, calmness, that inner sense of that which is of well-being. A long time ago, I heard somebody describe that as if you're out on the ocean in the midst of a big hurricane. On the surface, it's going to be tempestuous. It's going to be horrible. But down at the bottom of that sea, there's not any of that going on. It's calm. In the Christian's life and in his mind and heart, there's difficult times that come along. But does that take away the joy that I am a child of God? And I have forgiveness available in Christ. And I have this hope of heaven. There's nothing that can take that away. And so we need to remember that. There's also this sense that when we think about these difficult times, I don't know how many times I've gone to a hospital and people will ask the question sometime if they don't have any real religious scent about them, especially they're just kind of living their life and hear these things happen and they say, why did God do this to me? Well, I wonder how many times when they were having good times did they ask that. You know, you don't see that. But all of a sudden the bad comes along and now I'm going to blame God for that, but I blame me for the good that I would give myself the compliments for all the good times. Well, I got to remember something. This world and the experiences we have, good and bad, were brought into a world that were created by God. Now, he may or may not have had a providential case, especially in that sense of working to bring about one. It may not be. But the fact is, I need to see both together, and that one who has his focus on God, beyond life under the sun, who's thinking about life that is before God and what happens after this life. That's the one who's going to appreciate the whole of that life and who's going to understand, I not only get the good, I also get the bad. Both are going to be a part of that. And in that time of those days of darkness, I've got to understand there are going to be many. There's times of tears. There's times of mourning in this life. That's the way that it is. You're never going to escape that. Now, what do they do for us? What did chapter 7 tell us? It's better to go into the house of mourning, the house of feasting. Why? Living's going to take it to heart. That's the time when you really learn to think about it. Go ahead.
In James 2, he tells us to count it all joy when we fall into trial. Would that not be kind of what we're talking about here as well?
Sure, you have those kind of things that are there. It works patience in the end, James points out. So when we're looking at that, we see whether it's in good or in bad times, that does not negate our ability to rejoice. We can rejoice in all of that time and recognize that those days of darkness, there are going to be many. But when we keep that outlook of a spiritually minded person, where are we headed? When we recognize more in the New Testament about the sense of heaven and what it will be like, then you have an eternity that is without any exception of glorious. That sense of being with God, everything perfect. Now, it doesn't matter how many days we have that are bad. If we're looking ahead of that, and we've got that eternally, we doesn't figure out, hey, that's quite a deal. That's a good trade there. Anybody got anything else there? Go ahead.
When you say let him remember the days of darkness, is that, I mean, kind of like when it's better to be in the house in the morning, like I find it easier to have a good perspective in those dark days, you know. But is it saying remember those dark days, like kind of remember how you are during those times?
Sure.
So it's easier to live?
You remember those difficult times, and what do we see through those difficult times? We made it. And God took care of us. These kind of things, when we look at the days of darkness, a lot of times our starting look says, I'm never going to be okay again. But that's not true. We will. And as we see how we were able to overcome, and how they in the end made us better, then there's something good that comes out of it. That doesn't mean that we've got to look at the days of darkness and we're glad that those bad things happen. That's not the point. We're not glad that bad things happen. We're glad that when those do take place, God helped us through it. And He caused us to be ones that came out in the end overcoming. All right, anything?
It reminds me of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 12 through 18, and kind of this discourse, and then the end being then in verse 18, give thanks in all circumstances. Why? For this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus.
Right. That's exactly right. Those kind of statements make it clear over and over again that God's promise is with us just as much during the days of darkness as in the days of light. All right. Anybody else? All right. Going once, going twice. That's it. Here we go to verse 9. Last part of this particular chapter, which really begins what he's going to talk about more in chapter 12, and we'll cover more on that next week. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these God will bring you into judgment. Therefore remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. All right. Let me ask you at the end of that we start there first. He's talking about these things that ought to cheer your heart in youth. And yet at the end he says childhood and youth are vanity. They're empty. Meaning what?
Well, back when we were looking at that word vanity and first part, you had said there were several meanings like empty or vapor or futile or fleeting or pointless or unfulfilling. So, I don't know, I thought about childhood and youth are fleeting.
Okay.
I mean,
All right. I remember when we look at youth, we're in a culture that I guess for some time now has almost worshiped youth. The idea, you got people that want to wear a certain cream and have plastic surgery and everything else in order to look like, even though they're 65 or 70, they look like teenagers. Well, I've never seen a teenager with a cement face, which is what most of those people look like to get a stretch time. But you see this, that people want to be in that very young category. Why? I work for every one of my wrinkles. I don't want to get rid of them. Why would somebody want youth all the time? That's all they would think is useless.
I don't know that answer, but I'll tell you this. 50 looks younger every day.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm just
I'm convinced of that. I'm not going to say that. But when you think about youth, when you're a young person, what did you like about being young?
No responsibility.
All right, there's very little responsibility. What else?
No aches, no pains. You felt great all the
There
time.
you got me.
Are you not young anymore? Well, not
I can remember going through all of those kind of things where you could play to your heart's content. The next day you're ready to do it again. And after you got a drink out of the hose, you're ready to go out for another game. Everything there. Somewhere, I don't know, somewhere after I was about 50, I figured out what Ronnie never has figured out yet. And that's softball is not a game for older men. That's just not it. I understood that when I was aching and felt like somebody had beaten me with a sledgehammer and run over me with a Mack truck. But those kind of things that you see, you recognize there are benefits to youth. The idea of that mobility, that strength, energy. Are there benefits to older age? Why is it that God left the leadership positions in the church to those who, according to one description, are elders?
Wisdom.
They're not novices. One of the passages talks about with regard to that. There's patience that generally is developed through that time. Wisdom, some other things. Study, hopefully, has caused them to have a greater understanding and application of matters. Go ahead.
In the world of an employer, we look for people with experience. Experience is not something that you can just go pay for. You gotta live through it. So that experience that we have through these years makes us understand, even through our mistakes, what we should do instead of what we want to do sometimes. So the older we get, the more we should understand what is a better path.
Why did God put parents in charge of children rather than the other way around? Something learned there, isn't it? Some benefit to that age. Why in a family, there's usually somebody that's looked at as a patriarch, somebody that you go to that's one of the older ones, and you look to them for advice, encouragement, maybe a lesson on how you ought to do with regard to a particular thing. Well, Lord recognizes, Ronnie talked about that experience that teaches something there. When we look at age and youth, they both have their place. As you grow older, there is that wisdom, a greater understanding. Is there also tendency-wise that you understand more of the problems of life? Yeah. That's a part of getting older and understanding those things, having survived some of those problems that are there. Does your 4-year-old child wonder whether you're going to bring home enough of a check next month for them to eat? Why not? Trust that. That never entered my mind as a kid. In fact, I remember I was in high school before I ever thought about the fact that, it costs Mom and Dad a lot for us to live around here. I didn't know what our house payment was until I was in high school, and I thought, wow, how in the world do they afford to do all this stuff? And I recognize then part of that lesson that is there as we grow up is some of those cares tend to kind of start weighing on us or having an effect that's there. But in youth, what do? Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let what? Your heart cheer you in the days of youth. Interesting word, that one, to cheer you in the days of your youth. It really has to be something that, let me try to think how to make you well would be a good, or cause you to be acceptable or fulfilled. In youth, you look at everything from the positive side of it, tendency-wise. You don't know what the problems are. So you're looking at the positive side of that, and you let that cheer you. Is there anything wrong in that? No, that's the way youth is. But if I stayed like that until I was 65, would there be anything wrong with that? Oh, yeah. You're this somebody who's out here in an idealism, that's going to be there in youth. But at some point in time, you get that reality check that not everything goes well. So do we need to have something in youth to where there's something where we recognize we're looking forward to things. Things can go well in my life. Sure. That's why God put youth where He put it. At the beginning, that was there. Now, He says, you do that, you walk in the ways of your heart. You aim that life in a way that you're looking for that good. But while you're doing that, what do you need to remember? Know what? Okay. God will bring you into judgment. Know that for all of these, God will bring you into judgment. Is there a right and wrong way to use that cheerfulness of youth? Absolutely. And that's something we need to teach our young people. When you use that youth and its exuberance to go after things that are unlawful, whether it be in drugs or alcohol or sexual sins or any of that, what will that end up bringing into that one's life? Will that bring real good and lasting things of favor? No. What's going to happen? They're going to hurt their life. They're going to end up with scars in that. Are there going to be things that are there that through the rest of their life they're going to affect them? Absolutely. And that's the point that Solomon is making. He said, you live your life with that cheer, that positive outlook, that goodness that's there in youth, that this vibrance that has this outlook. But remember, you don't live youth without consequences. You live your youth with consequences that happen because of what you've done. You'll answer to God for that. And that is a message that we also need to teach our young people. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the other one, the other phrase there, in the sight of your eyes, that's more like the way youth also act now.
Yeah.
They don't think about in the future what's going to happen as a result of what I'm doing. They just look at it in the sight of their eyes. It's just like what's going on right now, not tomorrow or not years from now.
Tends towards that impetuousness.
Right, but in this, if you only look at the sight of your eyes, then the next phrase comes in and it says, "But God will bring you into judgment."
Correct. All right. Anybody else there? He says, so what do? Remove sorrow from your heart. He's talking to the young man. And put away evil from your flesh. You see how those are coupled? Remove the sorrow from your heart. You have that joyful outlook of life, but you also put away the evil from your flesh. For what? Childhood and youth are vanity. They pass. They're only a real part, a beginning part of your life. There's going to be a lot more years that we live with responsibility than we have with that always everything positive of youth. You go through that pretty quickly. You have to grow up. And there are problems that come along, and you've got to deal with those. And the point is, you put together that goodness that ought to be there, taking away sorrow, and you put away that evil so that what? So that you're ready for what comes after that youth. That's what we need to do. When you have youth that has that look for something that's good and it's hopeful, that's a great thing. Young people need to start out with that. I think it was Winston Churchill who one time said, you show me a kid at 20 who's not a liberal, and he'll show you a hard-hearted person. You show me a person of 45 who isn't conservative in his mind, and I'll show you an idiot. And that was the way he looked at the difference that was there. In his youth, if you look at what Churchill was, many people, they had this exuberance of youth, all these positive things that they thought the world could be wonderful. It's a good way to start out in life. But sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with the reality. And when that comes there, if you started out with that kind of a downward outlook, you wouldn't be looking for anything and do anything good. Those two put together in the right way help guide us the way that we should be. Go ahead, Scott.
You can see it a lot with the young in the church when you've been around here for a while and you see them being young and they hear the truth 3 times a week, and then they go off and get a little ornery for a while, and then they, by removing the evil from your flesh, you also remove a lot of sorrow from your heart.
Right.
And then you can see them come turn back and be, good.
And the earlier you turn from that, the more you can remove that sorrow. All right. Thomas were to lead us in prayer.